I first discovered this book in a bookstore in Santa Barbara called Chaucer's Books. It's a really cool bookstore if you happen to be in the area, with this very thin spine that read The Dwarf by Pär Lagerkvist. And my buddy out there, my Swedish friend, also esteemed horror author, Mats Evansson, hopefully I got that correct. He's going to correct me on the pronunciation in the comments to the best of his ability, I'm sure. But the title, the plainness of it, caught my eye, and I was not in the fantasy section. So I pulled the book down, and the cover was very intriguing. So I opened up the book. The first line was intriguing. The subsequent lines were intriguing. So why did it take me so long to read it? I can't tell you. I made note of it. I forgot about it, but I will have to thank Ricky over on my Discord. Thank you so much, man, for reminding me of this book. He read it. He asked me if I'd read it. He said it was a great character study and thought I would like it. And so here we are. I bumped it all the way up to the top of my list to check it out. But what is the hook? What is The Dwarf about? In an Italian city-state during the Renaissance, a man known as the Dwarf serves the prince's court. Evil and hateful toward nearly everyone, he lurks in the shadows, observing and plotting deplorable deeds. And when war comes to the city, the tide of his narrative turns. What part will he play? Hero or foe? Let's begin with character, and I guess we should start with the dwarf himself. So he is named once in this entire novel. I'm not even sure if it's his real name because it does translate to small in Italian, and that name is Piccolini or Piccolini. Forgive me, my Italian viewers out there, for the terrible pronunciation, but he is called this once by the daughter of the princess, and that is it. So whether or not that's his name or she was just calling him small, I have no idea. But because this book is written in first person, we, like all first person books, get a very detailed look at this individual. He is a servant of the prince, but he's always lurking in the shadows, he's always observing, he's always plotting. But he desperately wants to be part of bigger things, which he does get a chance to do. The dwarf is a very quote-unquote evil person. He's a very hateful person. He really despises everybody around him and everything, except the prince, of course. And that evilness does not change from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. Yes, he does not arc. He stays the same. And I know I talk a lot about arcs in this channel. I really enjoy seeing characters go through transformations, you know, learning a lesson maybe, or just getting a better insight into their life and their deeds and the people around them and the world they inhabit. And even though this character is presented to us as evil, he's not a one-note character. There's some great nuance that the writer provided here. And in fact, it happens at the very beginning of the book when he's describing himself. He talks about himself as being a dwarf, in fact, a separate race from humans, an ancient and important race. But remember, this isn't a fantasy novel. But then a little bit later, he mentions that his kind are born from humans. The mothers just discard them because of their deformities. And all of these dwarves end up as buffoons or serving the court or the castle in some regard. On one hand, he's creating a fiction. He's categorizing himself in this ancient and important race, but then shortly after, he's admitting who he is. And when I say he is hateful and hates everyone, he truly hates everyone except the prince, including his own kind. In fact, he admits to killing one of his own kind very early in the book. And I think it's worth reading the very opening lines of this book to give you a sense of the narrator.
I am 26 inches tall, shapely and well proportioned, my head perhaps a trifle too large. My hair is not black like the others, but reddish, very stiff and thick, drawn back from the temples and the broad but not especially lofty brow. My face is beardless, but otherwise just like that of other men. My eyebrows meet, my bodily strength is considerable, particularly if I am annoyed. When the wrestling match was arranged between Jehoshaphat and myself, I forced him onto his back after 20 minutes and strangled him. Since then, I've been the only dwarf at this court.
But this character, this narrator, is completely fascinating throughout this book, and I think I would not have liked it if he was completely one note, and despite the fact that he does not arc, there is some beautiful nuance to the character work, to the writing in this novel. There's one thing that goes without saying here, and you may be noticing a similarity to another very famous character in literature, that being Tyrion Lannister, the imp from George R.R. Martin's very famous A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, I don't know if George R.R. Martin read this book, but I would be surprised if he hadn't. There are so many similarities between Tyrion and the dwarf that it is uncanny. There are differences for sure. Tyrion is a more empathetic character. He's not evil through and through, but we do get to see more of him develop over time. He learns things, let's say. He arcs a little bit. The dwarf in this novel does not arc whatsoever. He prides himself on his evil deeds and his evil mind. I know Lee over on the Discord mentioned that he discovered this book when he was looking at what inspired George R. R. Martin. So I briefly looked and I couldn't find anything. So Lee, let me know in the comments below if in fact Tyrion Lannister is inspired by the character in this novel. And this got me thinking, really, when I saw the parallels between these two characters. And I know so many writers out there who were trying to be quote-unquote original, or they're worried that their work isn't original enough. Don't worry about it. We are all inspired by what we consume. Just embrace it and tell your story. Bernardo, another prominent character in this book, he is a man who mysteriously shows up at the castle and starts talking and working with the prince, and the dwarf is fascinated by him. And in fact, this man was obviously inspired by or modeled after Leonardo da Vinci, because he's a painter. He's painting the Last Supper even. Also, the Mona Lisa. He's also an inventor who helps the prince craft some machines of war. But the dwarf inevitably finds himself conversing with this man often because he is very interested in him. And this man is also interested in the dwarf. One of my favorite scenes in the book is actually when Bernardo wants to paint a portrait of the dwarf. And the dwarf is very resistant. But because he's small, he's overpowered and forced to pose for this portrait. And I thought it was a great example of this power dynamic between the two. Because the dwarf is narrating the story for us all the time, we're constantly viewing him in such a way as that he's in power, right? He's not the weak one. But this scene completely demonstrates the opposite of that. And it's funny because this book, he's actually writing this in a diary, we find out later in the book. So the fact that he wrote this down does say something about his character. The prince and the princess aren't major focal points of this novel, but they are mentioned. There are scenes with the dwarf. We learn that the princess is having affairs with all kinds of men, and in fact the dwarf questions if the princess's daughter is even the prince's daughter. The prince's character was interesting in the way that he was almost in the background, which is kind of strange because the dwarf is very loyal to him, right? He'll do anything he wants. He looks up to this man. Yet he always kind of exists in the background, almost like a shadow. But I thoroughly enjoyed all of the characters in this book, the parts they played, the dynamics they had between themselves, the scenes that unfolded with them. Let us talk about the plot next. Well, there's a lot of lurking. There's a lot of observation. And I think that was my favorite thing about this entire novel. The dwarf just kind of creeping through the castle in the shadows, listening in on conversations, having conversations of his own, and just devising these plots that he's going to unleash upon the world because he's a very evil man. But there's also a secondary element that's quite interesting, and that is the aspect of isolation. The dwarf is alone. He doesn't really have any friends. And all of the dwarves, all of the servants of the court, they live in these apartments. And there's a beautiful scene where he's musing about something I don't quite remember. But there's an army camped outside of the castle walls. There's all of these campfires, and he says something along the lines of that it's strange how he can see the campfires, but he cannot see the stars in the sky. And that line and other lines that relate to that line are kind of peppered throughout this book, and you could see that it was a recurring theme in this tale. Later on, there was a battle with a neighboring city, and you can see the dwarf is extremely eager to go into battle himself to serve the prince in this regard, and the prince, in fact, asks him to come along. And the dwarf does get to do a little bit of killing, not so much on the battlefield, but sort of on the battlefield. But the strange thing was, this was probably my least favorite part of the book. I guess I was just more of a fan of his plotting, among the cold stone of the castle walls versus him out here with his bloodlust. But I think this part of the novel really kind of demonstrates his evil nature and how he just hungers for blood completely. And after the battle concludes, a plague hits the city and the surrounding area, and there is a very crucial moment that the dwarf plays a part in that I'm not going to spoil for you, but let us just say that it spirals the story to its inevitable end. But while there is action, while there are events that unfold, this is clearly a character study. This is all about observation. It's all about introspection. And speaking of that, this book was written in 1944, and I believe it was published in 1945. And we all know a very short, a very evil man who's wreaking havoc during that time. Because the author is Swedish, and we know that Sweden during World War II, was neutral. I'm sure you can see the allegorical context here. There's plenty of stuff written online about how this is a response to World War II. There's also another interpretation stating that the dwarf represents the darkness or the evil that we find within ourselves. And in fact, there's a passage in the novel that speaks to that, so I can appreciate that observation as well. All of that is fine, but to me, what's important is not the allegory, it's not metaphor, it's not symbolism. Is this a good story? And yes, The Dwarf is a fantastic story. And I won't spoil the ending for you, but in the words of the editor, Sean Coyne, who created StoryGrid, the ending is, quote unquote, surprising but inevitable. And I think that's an ending we can all admire. Let's talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. This was originally written in Swedish, translated into English by Alexandra Dick, and I have absolutely nothing to complain about. The Dwarf leaped off the page at me. I could see his expressions, I could hear his voice, I could see him skulking around the castle, coming up with all kinds of terrible, terrible plans. And his voice felt appropriate for the time period, but not overwritten, which I find happens a lot in novels that are trying to replicate a time period. And I think there's this balance you have to strike between accuracy and readability. And I felt like this translation was extremely readable and it felt authentic just enough. So I can guarantee you that the writing will facilitate your immersion in this dwarf's tale, which is why I'm going to give The Dwarf by Pär Lagerkvist a 9 out of 10. A deep exploration of a man both shunned and accepted by his people, who has evil in his heart, but there are glimpses of light to be found, a plot that is exactly what it needs to be, not too epic and not too dull. A fantastic book that I'm finally glad I got to read. Thanks again, Ricky, for reminding me. Highly, highly recommend this book. So go out and read it. That is the review. Hope you liked it. If you did, give me a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more of me and what I have to say about books and other things. And if you would like to check out my own creative work, my own novels, you can check out the link in the description below. Thanks for hanging out with me, and thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Hey you, yeah, you still watching. Wow, you watched all the way to the end. Why am I whispering? I have no idea, but I'm gonna start doing this thing on this channel. When I read a book that I feel is exceptional, right? Maybe a 9 out of 10 or higher even, maybe a little bit lower, just something I feel that needs to be read, I'm going to give a copy away to the first person below who comments the name of the dwarf or what his name might be, and that is Piccolini. And I'll put the text at the bottom of the screen so you know how to spell it. So comment below with his name, as well as why are you excited to read this book? So we'll see how long this takes to catch on. We'll see how many people watch this far into the video. So thanks again. Good luck. Hope you win. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.